Tim Page is a Pulitzer Prize-winning music critic who found out in middle age that he had the autistic disorder Asperger's syndrome.
The new Manual of Psychiatric Disorders does not include Asperger's disorder. That diagnosis, recognized since 1994, goes away, as do others related to autism. They will now be considered part of a broad category known as autism spectrum disorder.
Standard fare. It might be, except that the title character, Adam, has Asperger's syndrome, a high-functioning variant of autism. People with Asperger's are often exceptionally intelligent and verbally gifted, but socially awkward, since they have trouble reading emotional cues from others. Many with Asperger's have a special interest which can become an obsession. In the film, Adam's special interests are astronomy and theater history.
My autistic. Ultimately, what the doctors labeled me was attention deficit disorder, not autistic. And I've had many friends in my life who are either autistic or Asperger's, and the parallels between ADD and autism were really quite amazing to me, and I just kind of wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
When you get up on the highly verbal end of the spectrum, ADD, ADHD, attention deficit, and Asperger's and autism, there's a lot of overlap, and the stimulant medicines tend to help.
The differences between Asperger's and autism have always been subtle, and who gets which label can be pretty arbitrary. So for health professionals, a single broad category makes sense. But for a lot of people with Asperger's, the proposed change is upsetting. Both involve restricted, repetitive behaviors and difficulties with social interaction. Asperger's is often considered a mild form of autism, but some people diagnosed with Asperger's actually have more difficulty functioning in society than some people labeled autistic. So instead of agonizing over autism versus Asperger's, clinicians can focus on each person's specific difficulties with communication or social interaction or information processing.
You, of course, have special skills too, and this movie is about how you became aware that they were special and then how you learned to apply them to a very specialized set of circumstances. And there is a number of circumstances I wanted you to talk about, and I was unaware of this, that you benefited so much from a series of wonderful teachers, beginning with your mother.
Well, Mother got me into really good early educational intervention. She kept me out of an institution. I had a fantastic science teacher that got me motivated, and then I could start using my visual thinking skills in science.
I personally am probably going to have a very hard time calling myself autistic.
Michael John Carley runs the Global and Regional Asperger Syndrome Partnership in New York. He says many people with Asperger's take pride in a diagnosis associated with some big names.
Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, Thomas Jefferson, Emily Dickinson.
Carley says under the new system, these geniuses would represent just one extreme on a spectrum.
And yet on the vast other extreme, somebody who might have to wear adult diapers and maybe a head restraining device. This is very hard for us to swallow, that these two extremes might indeed just have different variations of the same condition.
But Carley says he realizes that there's strong scientific evidence supporting that idea. And he says efforts to separate Asperger's and autism just haven't worked. Catherine Lord from the University of Michigan is part of the group that decided to combine all the autism-related diagnoses into one. She says the current system is a mess.
The categories are just not used by clinicians in a reliable fashion.
Lord says the change is not an effort to influence how people with Asperger's or autism identify themselves.
The intent is to try to make the diagnosis of autism, what we're calling autism spectrum disorders, clearer and to better reflect the science and also the knowledge of how people use these terms.
So instead of agonizing over autism versus Asperger's, clinicians can focus on each person's specific difficulties. But Grinker says losing the Asperger's diagnosis does not mean families will lose services they need.
Almost anybody with an Asperger's diagnosis also could qualify for what is called autistic disorder.
And he says the change could actually make it easier for parents who are struggling to get help for a child with Asperger's.
They may be denied services from certain regional or state centers because their child doesn't have a diagnosis of autism. I know this is the case in California. And so removing Asperger's really removes what is a false barrier to parents getting care for their kids.